So yeah, and I just throw my 2 cents in on the previous question. Consider also places where the societal or other kind of resource availability is there, and take advantage of that. Demonstration sites, visibility. If you have a willing partner and someone like a road commission or whatever, there's factors outside of, I think, just the ecological conditions and site prioritization and stuff that we can certainly consider too. So I also, like Chris, kind of thought, as he said with Phyllis's presentation, as he was presenting, I was, jotting some notes, and honestly, what I'm going to present today, I think, you could distill down into that punchlines slide from Chris, which was really great, with the RAD framework. So what I'm going to talk about is a document that has been developed for TNC staff, but is publicly available, and I think is applicable to this kind of questioning and planning around land management with an eye towards climate resilience. Maybe provide a little bit more of a framework for decision making, a way to think about site by site examples, and give you some defensibility and some guidance towards making the right decisions on when you engage in these invasive species management projects, or what type of engagement you have. So this builds off of something that I presented a number of years ago at a MISC conference, which is the Nature Conservancy's Resilient Connected Network Mapping tool. And I'm not going to go into detail on this today, but I would just say I know we've got a lot of new coordinators, and anybody who wants a refresher. Resilient Land, the tool itself has a primer on the core concepts in the upper right corner if you visit it. And if you go to TNC's Conservation Gateway site and search for Resilient Land, there's a whole host of other materials associated with this. And the summary here is that we think this is a mapping tool that can help land managers prioritize kind of the biggest return on investment in terms of management. So that's the lands that we predict to be resilient based on factors like microtopography and local connectedness, as well as sites that have connectivity to other sites and offer climate flow corridors that allow species to move. So there's an extensive mapping tool and lots of data that you can dive into if you're more interested. And please get in contact with me. I'd be happy to discuss it with anyone who's curious about how they might implement that data set as kind of a prioritization tool in their work. So that's about, that tool really directs you towards maybe like a protection mindset in terms of actual fee land protection for conservation, for land trusts or agencies or whatnot. But in this realm of management, there was a need that was not addressed directly by that mapping tool. And it was identified at a conference that TNC had in 2018. It was picked up by our Invasive Species Advisory Council. And it was based on the work of Dr. Mark Anderson, who led the Resilient Connected Network mapping project. And he kind of was, frustrated that the literature at the time, 2015, 2016, largely described climate change as a disturbance rather than a fundamental change in ambient condition, which kind of stuff that Chris was talking about as well. It's not enough to just protect the lands that are resilient, but we have to manage them, and that's important to all of our conservation outcomes. And ultimately, land stewards are going to need guidance on how to manage their preserves or other protected lands under climate change. So the focus of the work was to use that action map of resilient and connected lands, and then combine it with the idea of managing the stage, which I'll touch on in a little bit, as a way to identify resilient sites. The team was really led by Karen Lombard, so I take very little credit for any of the material here. I did help review a bit, so I know just enough to be dangerous, but I'm really acting as a liaison between the work and conservation partners in the state and kind of in the region. So feel free to get in contact with me about this, but know that I may redirect you as appropriate to people who know more than I. So primer on site resilience, this is ultimately the capacity of a place to maintain some kind of diversity or function in the face of climate change. And landscape resilience is sites that are resilient, but also have some kind of connectivity between them that allow for the processes that play out on sites to continue to happen. The species movement, the ecosystem function, all of that. The analogy that's used is kind of stage versus actors. The site is the stage, it's the underpinning of all the things that happen on top of it, kind of the abiotic stuff, the geology. And then the system and the species are the actors. And it requires a bit of a shift in thinking away from managing for species outcomes to managing a site with a broad range of outcomes that can benefit species and resultant systems. The document that I'm teasing here that came out of this work, just know that the scope of it is really the Eastern US as it was developed. But there were other, nationwide folks that weighed in. So I think it's applicable at scale. It's certainly applicable here in Michigan. And it really does provide a way of thinking about how to manage in the face of climate change. But I will tell you flat out, it does not, and it explicitly says this, give you a roadmap towards exactly what to do. It is not the flow chart of if this, then that. So it's something to help spur thinking and to drive, I think, a more progressive line of questioning about how we make decisions, and in some cases, forcing us to really evaluate whether something is worth taking on in the first place. As with anything these days, and especially anything that TNC does, uses the adaptive management framework, and so I'll use that as kind of the coat rack on which I hang the different components of the work. And the first is simply assessing the impacts to site resilience. And so an example of that is like looking at species movement over time. We've seen a lot of species movement in the face of not only changing climate, but precipitation as a result of that. So in this example, we've seen 86 tree species move north and west by roughly 10 miles a decade. And that's significant, and that has major implications for what type of management you're going to implement and how it relates to what you expect or want the site to be in the future. The second aspect is to select a management strategy. And the framework, very similar to what Chris talked about with the Resist, Accept, Direct, came from a paper by Miller et al. In 2007 about a forest management approach to forest adaptation. And there's really three parts to that. There is resistance. This is about the kind of critical species, the TNE, honestly, like, the Carner Blue example of critical biodiversity that's unlikely to persist under a changing climate, and in a lot of cases where there's really no place where those species can even move to. We describe it as kind of an emergency strategy. This is going to be really, really resource intensive. The chances of success of this management approach are not high in the face of climate change. So we're really trying to redirect away from that. And in the forest adaptation approach, they have both resilience and transition. But for our paper, we really merged those just into resilience. And the reason being that we kind of assume that if there's going to be, major significant changes, we're automatically going to have transition. And so it wasn't really necessary to tease those apart. I'd also note that in the same way that Chris noted the accept option, there may be a no action choice from this framework as well, and that's about winnable battles and about resource availability and all that kind of stuff. Then we get down into an actual design for management, and we would think that you would want to prioritize site resilience, site being that stage. And then we hope that that would be followed by system resilience, or the response of the actors on the stage. So you're looking at what you want for outcomes, long-term goals, short-term benchmarks, all that good kind of project management and strategic planning stuff. So when when Mark talks about kind of resilience in the face of climate change and how that relates to the systems and the species on top of the site or the stage, it's the physical properties that underpin the land and the water and are the key drivers for biodiversity. So we really we're shifting our thinking to a place where, again, instead of managing for individual species outcomes like number of populations or something, about a broader approach towards site scale or landscape scale management and connectivity. So these are the stages. there's stuff underneath those pictures, right? That is kind of the abiotic conditions, and what results from those stages are, of course, all of the actors. And when we are thinking about somewhere in between kind of managing for just the site or managing just for the actors, we're getting into this realm of maintaining kind of a desired composition or structure. This is where I'll use the invasive species example that's really relevant to this group. So work from the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change team at the University of Massachusetts. Modeling showed that the Northeast is going to be an invasive hotspot under climate change. And they've identified a subset of species that we should be most concerned about. And as we all know, there's definitely more to come. Fortunately, you can see from the modeling there that Michigan is a little bit buffered versus some other areas. And I'm also really sad that in this slide, I don't have the rabbit pulling its ears off that's so famous from Phyllis's slide. I did Google for that rabbit and was unable to find it, so I'll have to get that from Phyllis. The paper itself is pushing land managers to think about 4 aspects of resilient sites. Those are the connectivity and or fragmentation, soils, hydrology, and fire regime. And this is definitely Northeast U.S. focused. It may be missing some factors, especially on the resilient systems, but we would push to think about improving the condition of the abiotic stage first. And an example of this, I think, would be instead of doing intensive restoration at a given site, could we be thinking about perhaps a less resource-intensive restoration approach to create some connectivity, to connect that site to another area? If the if the species at a given site are likely to be extirpated or need to move, then a minor amount of invasive species management to create some kind of corridor between that site and a site perhaps further north may, in the long term, be more effective than an intensive invasive species management project at the site itself to get to some, standard, right? Some level of invasive species presence or absence. The guidance document also says, you should really be asking yourself these questions about each element of resilience. Why is that element an important management consideration for resilience? How will climate change impact that element? How might management change? And what should we monitor to know that the management is working? And that takes us then to the last step in the adaptive management cycle, which is, of course, do, learn, and share. And that's where this group and myself would be really interested in hearing feedback from folks on what's working and what isn't, what questions there are, and what things aren't being addressed. So with all of that, this is where you can actually get to the paper itself. It's hosted at our Center for Resilient Conservation Science, which, paper or not, I would really encourage everyone to check out, because there's a whole host of information there, and a lot of it is non-site specific. It's getting people to ask these questions, maybe move their thinking in a different direction. It could be really helpful for your partners and stakeholders of a SISMA to help kind of move them along and build in some shared ideology and some support for this kind of work. And then there is a section specifically in the document about invasives. It's section 5.3 there's a section on both plant and animal invasives. So would love any thoughts or feedback that folks have on that as well. And I believe that's it for me.